If you've noticed, I've been doing a lot of bandsaw videos lately on my Reels, on my Instagram, on my Facebook Reels, and on my YouTube Shorts, and I've been getting a lot of questions. I'm making this video to show you 5 to 7 things that people get wrong about the bandsaw when they're beginning their bandsaw journey. I've been on the bandsaw since I'm about 6 or 7 years old, and I'm 56 now, so that's about 50 years I've been using the bandsaw. And when I was in high school, I cut out letters at a sign shop for many years, and I did that quite a bit. I learned a few things along the way, and I'm going to show you some of those mistakes that people make in the beginning and several tips on how to correct those mistakes. So the biggest mistake that most people make, I get calls from people all the time and they're saying, my saw is drifting, it's not cutting well, it's burning, it's smoking. And then I'll ask them a simple question. When did you change the blade last? And they'll say, I don't know, I bought the saw used, the blade was on it. It sounds ridiculous, but I've gotten that answer more than you would imagine. When you keep old blades, they're simply just in case you need to cut metal or something else. But when the blades get dull, throw them away. When you buy a used saw, first thing you do is get rid of the blade. Don't ever use a stamped blade. When I was a kid, my dad used to buy Sears stamped blades. They were horrible. They would go dull immediately and then immediately start drifting. The only thing they would be good for cutting is maybe foam rubber or foam insulation. But for cutting wood, they were horrible. When I was about 17, 18 years old, we began to buy blades from Suffolk Machinery, which is now Timberwolf blades. I have no endorsed agreement with them at all, but I've just been buying their blades since about 35 years now. And so Timberwolf blades are the best blades that I personally like to use. I get them in 1/4 inch and 1/8 inch, which is what's on this saw right now. This is an 1/8 inch, 14 tooth per inch, and I get a 1/4 inch, 14 tooth per inch, and sometimes I get a 3/8 blade, 14 tooth per inch. For cutting the material that I like to cut, it's the best. We cut MDF, sometimes brass and aluminum, and not only is it a good cut, believe it or not, for cutting your hands, which you don't want to do, but it is a safer blade to get injured on. If you're using a 14 tooth per inch for resaw, that is a dangerous blade. That blade will pull you in, it'll suck your hand in. General purpose cutting, I would get a 14 tooth per inch. One common mistake I see most often is people cutting round objects on a bandsaw. Whether it's a round peg or a hockey puck or baseball or a golf ball, I see people sticking them into the bandsaw blades and then they go bananas. Because this is a conveyor belt. The minute you stick this against it, it just goes crazy. It spins in every direction. You need to fixture this. You need to grab it with a clamp. You need to hot glue it or screw it to something. Another dangerous thing to try and stick into a saw is like a natural shape, like a tree branch. Everything needs to be fixtured down, especially if you're not confident and if you don't have the experience and you don't know what's gonna happen. Fixture it down to the table. You don't want it to spin. Put it in a cradle, grab it with a screw clamp. Just anticipate that it will get sucked out of your hands. It is scary and you let the piece go flying. Always fixture something round, especially a ball or a rod or a pipe or something like that. Let's see what happens when I stick this in here. That's what happens, and if you're not ready for it, it's very scary. Make sure your clamp is flat against the table so it's not going to rock. And that's how you cut a round object on the bandsaw. You can also hold a baseball with one of these. I know because I've done it. So this is another common mistake I see people do. They want to cut the corners off of something square. And they might approach it like that. I call this high siding, like on a motorcycle. You don't want a high side, so the high side here is going to pull that down onto the table. The safer choice would be to flip it over and go like that, because you have all this leverage to keep that from pulling this way. When you're here, it's just physics. It wants to pull down against the table, you'll bend the blade, you'll break your piece of wood, and you'll poop in your pants. So Whenever you're going to cut the corner off of something, if you're going to sculpt like I do on the bandsaw, be careful you don't high side. Always make sure that the bottom of your cut, you either have the leverage of the material or you have the support of something underneath. And I'll show you a couple of examples of that. If you did want to make a high side cut like this, I'll show you a safe way to do it. You could also adjust the table, but if you don't want to adjust the table and you need to make a temporary simple cut, you could raise up your blade support, and I'll show you with a piece of scrap what I would do. And that's a way to support a high side cut. Or you could just cut it that way, but if you can't because the object or the shape of the wood, then you do something like that. Now this is the insert that removes so that you could change the blade. These are very important. Most bandsaw manufacturers, to them this is an afterthought. They give you a plastic insert. When I see a saw in somebody else's shop that has a plastic insert, I immediately put a piece of material over it, cut into the blade as my new table support. Any little piece of debris that comes off of your cut is gonna get stuck in those little holes. A bandsaw manufacturing company makes the bandsaw dangerous with the bad insert. This is an insert I made out of brass. It's pretty beat up. It's probably about 15 years old. But sometimes when I need a perfect zero clearance, I will just take a piece of material in there, and then I have a zero. I can make little tiny small cuts and not have to worry about it getting stuck in the insert plate. So I just grabbed a piece of scrap that's been sitting here, but you can get a nice piece of acrylic, saw it into, put some double-sided tape, and then you have a zero clearance plate. Occasionally you go to a high school shop and the plate is totally missing because nobody cares, nobody takes care of the tools. This is too dangerous. You shouldn't go near this because your blade could pull the piece of material into it, especially if it's something small. If this is your circumstance and you're in a public shop or a shared shop, put a piece of material over this, just a full piece of clean cut plywood. And then you're good to go. And if you need to change the blade, you take the plywood off, you change the blade, you put the zero cut plate back in. So people always want to know how I set my guide blocks. There's all types of this guide block, that guide block, there's all types of math. This is the guide block that's been on this saw since I was a little kid. I got this particular saw, this exact machine, not this model, this exact machine, I've had since I was about 7 years old, 6 years old. My dad bought it from the family of a fireman who passed away when he was a fireman when I was a little kid. And this bandsaw has been the one bandsaw I've used nearly at least once a week for the last 49 years. And the bearing is the same, the guide blocks are the same, I haven't changed them. You just make sure that the teeth are sticking out past the guide block and that the bearing is spinning on the bottom and the top. The bottom guide blocks are the same. If we looked at them, the teeth would be sticking out just past the guide blocks and the bearing just pushes right on the back of the blade. And I always make sure that the crown at the top, the blade is right either in the middle or just past the crown. When you back out, when you're making a cut and you're backing out and the blade wants to follow your cut and come off of the wheels, that's because your crown is the wheel's not tilted back enough, keeping that blade back there, or your guide blocks are pushing the blade too far forward. And any little instigation will pull the blade off. It shouldn't be. It should always be leaning back a little bit against the guide blocks. It's always worked for me. I've never had to buy new guide blocks or change them. When it gets worn out right here, I just pull them out and flip them over, or put them on the grinder and flatten them out. So it's kissing the flat back part of the blade The teeth stick out just in front of it. It's not complicated. And the reason I like this particular model, this is a 1960s, 1940s Delta Rockwell, Delta Milwaukee 14-inch. You can adjust all the guides by hand. You just need Allen key to push the guide blocks in and out, which isn't an adjustment you make a lot. All these are done by hand. All the guide blocks at the bottom are all done by hand. You don't need to break out an Allen key or anything. That's the reason why I like this saw. All the new modern saws have Allen keys everywhere. Drives me bananas, which is keeping me from buying a brand new saw, because they all have Allen keys to adjust all this stuff. I want to just loosen this, turn this in and out, lock it, I'm good to go. I don't want to have an Allen key in my pocket while I'm trying to be creative. This is another thing that drives me crazy, and I know this is something that most high school shop teachers teach. It is useless. It is pointless. Don't do this because it just makes your curve cuts bad. If you want to make a curve, there's a curve. I don't know why certain teachers teach you to do this. They make you cut relief cuts. The only thing a relief cut is going to do is give you a facet on your curve. Do you want this curve to be faceted and have a start and stop point right there? You want one clean curve. You don't want stops and starts and stops and starts. The only time you might need a relief cut is if you're cutting a large piece and you want to lighten your piece. Then cut that off and cut that off, and then give yourself a nice clean cut on the curve. There's no reason to put relief cuts on anything. Again, if it's just a matter of lightening up your load, just cut some of the scrap off and then make one clean curve using your whole upper body to make the turns. Don't cut from your shoulders because you'll get a staggered cut. One clean cut. I didn't have to stop and get rid of the scrap and then start and then get rid of the scrap again and start again. Don't do this. It's not necessary. Can you see that? There's an outside curve here that I'm going to cut. We're going to get rid of that material. And then over here, we're going to get rid of this material. I want to show you just a tip on cutting with a thick blade that doesn't seem like it could stand the turn. And it can't, but I'm going to show you how you could use this blade to make these tight turns. What you don't want to do is force it. When you hear the blade burning and slowing down, you're going to destroy the blade. You won't hurt the saw, but you'll destroy the blade, and if the blade cost you, in this case, this blade's like 200 bucks, you don't want to destroy the blade, but in the smaller saws with a 93.5-inch blade, those blades could be $20 a piece. So you don't want to force them, especially if you have a resaw blade on them. You don't want to force the turn, but there are tricks, and I'll show you some examples if you watch up close. Now, my piece broke in half during the cut, which is obvious, but if you couldn't see what I was doing, I was backing out and making more relief for the thickness of the blade. So I would cut, I'd back up and make some more relief, back up, make some more relief, and each time going a little bit deeper on the cut. I should show you that one more time. I'm going to do it on a second piece of wood, just to be more explicit. Maybe we could slow it down. And that's how I cut that 6-inch radius with a 1-inch deep bandsaw blade. You need to make those relief cuts as you go, and if you were doing the same thing, you do the same thing on the inside. No relief cuts off of it, just in your path. I'm very daring on the bandsaw. I take a lot of risks. It's only because I have a lot of experience. I have cut my fingers several times over the years. Pretty bad in some cases. Never cut anything off on the bandsaw particularly, but I've cut into my fingers a lot. And over the years, I developed the habit of using a fat pencil with a thick eraser to flick away, especially when I'm doing small parts like letters and scroll work. It's extremely important to keep your fingers away from there because you don't want to get blood on your work. A little piece of an eraser is not going to bleed, and it helps get the little parts out like that, and you don't get your fingers sucked down in there. So use a fat pencil with a rubber eraser as your bandsaw push stick. This push stick also works for turning the camera on and off. Here's a quick tip to remind you how to keep your table square to your blade, if that's important to you. You can use a T-square, but if you want to double check when you're about to cut, just cut into your material and then flip it around, and if it fits into the blade in the same exact way, then you're 90 degrees, you're square, you're square. We turn it off, pull it out, and we fit into there square, square to the table, and that's how you know your blade is square. Here's a mistake I see often take place in a shared shop or a makerspace. People will get their saw blade all the way deep inside some scroll work and pull the blade off the bandsaw trying to back out of it. I'll show you a foolproof way to get out of any predicament with your bandsaw blade. Watch. Just turn it off. And back your way out of the cut. In some cases, you can't back out. Cut your way all the way through it. Cut off into the scrap. So you see, I cut my shape. I just cut my shape, and then I just cut my way out of the scrap instead of trying to back all the way out. Always look for your way out, or just turn the saw off and back your blade out. But don't pull the blade off. I hope I was able to answer some questions, and I hope these tips will help get you started in a safe way. If you want to get creative with the bandsaw, just be careful. Baby steps as you develop your confidence. So if you want to get creative, stick with the blade, the higher tooth count. That's, I use an 1/8 inch 14 TPI for doing all my creative bandsaw work, because you can make tight turns. You can kind of use the saw blade like the way a chainsaw artist uses a chainsaw. There's lots of videos on practical resawing. I'm giving you more of the creative bandsaw tips that I learned over my lifetime. If you have any tips or tricks, put them in the comments below. Let me know if you like this type of video. I'll do more of them. Suggest a couple of things in the comments and I'll be reading them. Thank you very much. Love and respect. Be careful bandsawing.